There have been several experiences that I regret because I went along with sex because it seemed like the safest way to exit the situation. The easiest way to actually get done with this would be to just do it.
She said a feeble no, right? Like that's the famous judgment
Yeah.
in the Faruqi case. She said a feeble no. She didn't really mean it. I didn't hear her demurral. I didn't sense her discomfort because I've not been trained to listen to the unspoken.
He seemed into me, but then didn't want to do anything physical. And part of me thought, like, what kind of a man is going to turn down sex?
Rights are a basic, but to exercise your personhood, to be recognized as a person, means your pleasure has to be recognized. And the idea that pleasure is diverse has to be recognized and accepted and even woven into the fabric of society.
I'm Leeza Mangaldas, and this is Love Matters, a podcast about the relationship topics that matter to you and me. And today we're going to be talking about consent, beyond just yes and no. How can we make space for the more difficult to categorize experiences, the feelings that lie in between? After all, to quote the wonderful feminist thinker Paromita Vohra, who happens to be my guest today, where is consent without a diversity of desires and a galaxy of desirability? Today, Paro and I are going to be talking about all the messy human things that we don't get to talk about when we usually talk about consent. And I want to quickly introduce Paro, who is someone I have been a fan of forever. She is an extraordinary writer, artist, thinker, filmmaker, founder of the iconic digital project Agents of Ishq, which explores sex and love and pleasure and the body in the most delicious, yummy, fun, desi way. And I'm just so pleased to be able to chat with you, Paro, today. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me here. Thank you for that loving introduction. And it's really nice to be here.
I'm so glad. Well, I'm going to dive right in because honestly, one of my favorite artistic explorations of consent is your Lavani video, the amorous adventures of Shaku and Megha in the Valley of Consent. And in it, Megha, when describing consent, she says, "Nazuk bhi ana ugad bhi," and that line really stuck with me. It's delicate and complicated, right? And then there's a beautiful refrain of "me manli, maybe, maybe, maybe." And so I thought we could just start with having you expound upon that idea of consent being a delicate, complicated matter and one where we need space for maybe.
Yes, the consent Lavani, meaning I would love to tell the story of how the Lavani originated to explain also how it was able to present this complex idea of maybe and many other lived experiences around consent that are not incorporated when we make absolute principles, right? Now, obviously, when we make an absolute principle like yes means yes and no means no, there is no essential disagreement with that. It's just that it's not always enough to deal with the many different contexts that we actually live in. So I went to see a performance of the Lavani dancers, and I had never seen a real proper Lavani like outside a movie before, right? So for me it was a revelation at several levels. Most of all, I just couldn't get over how this delicate balance of teasing the audience, pushing their boundaries, and at the same time being so sexual was all happening together in this fairly respectable place in Bombay, like the Ravindranath Mandir, Pula Deshpande Hall, which Bombay people will know, is like a kind of center of respectable culture almost, right? And I just knew that like I wanted to do some work with the Lavani performers because I don't think I had ever really seen some kind of cultural artifact where women's desire, or rather women spoke about desire so freely, so openly, and also in such a sophisticated manner, right? Because Lavani is something that is done mostly for a male audience. So there is a power dynamic between the woman performer and the masculine audience, but there is also a lot of playing with power that happens through the arts, right? Like the way that the teasing that happens. So I remember that while watching and looking at Shakubai, who is like a really well-known performer, I kept feeling that I hope you want her to pay attention to you, but you're scared that she'll pay attention to you, that kind of thing. And I thought, like, how can I work with them? And then we had just started Agents of Ishq just a few months before, literally, right? I think we had just about launched when I watched the Lavani. And we knew that consent is something that young people are thinking about a lot. Like we are speaking before Me Too actually became so important a way of talking about sexual harassment and violence. But we are talking about a time just after the Delhi gang rape where there's a lot of conversations about sexual violence and some conversation about consent was kind of surfacing. And one of the things that we really noticed is that it was very hard for people in this yes means yes and no means no binary to speak about times when perhaps they hadn't been able to enact perfect consent, right? And that there was a certain sense of unease about being someone who hasn't been able to tick the yes means yes and no means no box like a fully formed pre-existing feminist person, right? And actually it also seemed like even people who said yes means yes and no means no is something I really believe in and enthusiastic consent, etc., they struggled to understand how to incorporate it into the actuality of sex. Because the thing is that many things that we discuss around these issues are always in abstraction. Like, they're abstract questions of behavior, of politics, and too much of sex is discussed as sexuality and not as actual sex. Because in actual sexual interaction, there are people. People are a complex intersection of their social identity, their personal biography, what the moment is like, I mean, what is the relationship between two people, so on and so forth. So, how do we actually create sets of principles or sets of works which are permeable in that way? They have that porous kind of quality where many people can enter with their experiences and make sense of their experiences and take away something that will help them to live their sexual lives better. And to me it seemed really that there was this vast spectrum of maybe that nobody was talking about, like between the yes and the no, is there no journey? That's really the question. And I think, when you think about the fact that we live in a time of dating apps, and even a dating app is a yes means yes, no means no mindset for people. That once you've swiped right, there is a journey still to meeting, to seeing if you like each other, to also having fun together, which is kind of lost in the idea that once you've swiped right, because the most common question on dating apps is what are you looking for here, and the answer I'm not sure, I'll know it when I see it, or I'm just looking, is not acceptable for many people because they feel like, well, then you're playing games, you should immediately tell me what you want. So the pressure to know what you want before you've even had an experience, I don't think it really does. It doesn't help anybody within that world of consent. So actually, when we wrote the Lavni, we wrote this idea of somebody who says yes, but says yes to something, not to everything. Like she meets a boy in the market and then she decides to go with him for a walk or hang out with him a bit, and then he wants to go all the way in, as she says, like when they get home. So, Lavni is full of double meanings. And one of the things we thought about when we were writing it was that we must have a double meaning, otherwise, the fun of the Lavni is gone. And so we came up with the he didn't get my point, which really is the double meaning for the clitoris as well as the point of the conversation. And so if you watch the Lavni carefully, now that I've told you this, you will notice that the dance step is like they look down when they say he didn't get my point, right? So everything also served as a metaphor for I agreed to make out a bit, but I didn't want to go all the way, so on and so forth. So there was this one idea of a yes that is not like an unconditional yes. There was a no which wasn't meant as a no. And I thought it was very important to present this because the most common thing that men say about women when they override women's consent is that it's no on her lips, but it's yes in her heart. And women don't really mean no when they say no. Now, the thing is, most of us want to immediately counter that because we know that it is used in order to override what women are saying. But it's also true that many women find it difficult to say yes because there is such a stigma on being a woman who is sexually open and sexually desiring. Of course, it is slightly decreasing today, but this is still an overall sense that, we don't see women and their desire like presented in our culture or in most cultures. So we actually don't have any concept that women have desire and therefore women have a choice of whether they want to go forward or not go forward with something sexual. I think it was important to say that when women say no, though they want to say yes, it is because of a larger surrounding patriarchal context in which a woman who says yes is not respected or is not seen, like she says, he'll think I'm Chalu, seen as a fast girl, a person who actually once she has said yes has no other agency or no other choice in anything that she wants to do going forward. And so, of course, like in this complex no, even the yes and the no are complicated in the Lavani, right? So then finally, when we get to the maybe seems so much less complicated than the yes and the no, because in a sense, it just says, let's see how we feel. And I think the other thing that resides in the maybe is the idea of pleasure. That, pleasure is something that we will feel out, because pleasure is not a one size fits all. And what I find pleasurable and what you find pleasurable may be very different. And they would be very different because not just a matter of taste, but it's a matter of whole cultural backgrounds. It's a matter of my caste, my gender, my sexuality, what I have been exposed to, and yes, of course, my tastes, all of those things. So actually, the maybe is also a time of understanding each other and understanding what is pleasurable to the other person, bit by bit, before we can arrive at a yes or a no. And of course, in a utopian sense, we imagine that if we lived in a world where sexualness was comfortable, it was not tabooed, it was not so rife with questions of power, where it was about pleasure and relationality, that even hearing a no may not feel like such a rejection and may not feel like such a crushing end to a story, but could also be arrived at lovingly. So, actually, this idea of the maybe holds in it the entire sense of sexual relationships, as pleasurable relationships, as mutual relationships. And I think that's why it becomes a really useful kind of way to think about consent, beyond the yes and the no, which is like without taking away the yes means yes and no means no, in some kind of a perfect world. I don't even know if that would be a perfect world, but in some kind of an equal world where yes and no are very simple and can be said at any time. But other than that, the maybe is about mutuality, and I think it really helps us to think afresh about many different things.
I think so too. And you've already touched upon so many different aspects of consent that I wanted to draw out in subsequent questions. I could just be quiet. I feel like this could just be all you. I love listening to you. But thank you for touching upon so many things. I'm going to get you to sort of elaborate on some of those points a little further, and I wanted to start with gender roles, which you touched upon a little bit. When I look back at my own personal experiences navigating, sexual negotiations, I guess, especially in my teens and early 20s, when you're really just starting to figure out who you are and having your first relationships, and really without any roadmap to do so. I think the legal or sex educator framework of yes means yes, no means no does indeed become much more difficult to practice when you're physically in the same, close proximity with another body. And when I look back at my own experiences, despite, all the wokeness or feminism or whatever else that I may have tried to acquaint myself with, I would be lying if I didn't say that there have been several experiences that I regret, because I went along with sex because it seemed like the safest way to exit the situation. The easiest way to actually get done with this would be to just do it. I've also, I think, had at least one interaction where I was really attracted to a man, and he seemed into me, but then didn't want to do anything physical. And part of me thought, like, what kind of a man is going to turn down sex? Even though we internalize the gender stereotypes, right? Somewhere it is so hard not to let that play into your experiences. This idea that the woman is the necessary sexual gatekeeper, the man is the necessary sexual predator, or that somehow it is, as you said, desires like this place of degradation for women, so we must downplay our desires. And so, how do you think those gender roles and sort of the expectations and pressures that society places upon the genders in different ways play into how we are able to navigate consent?
I think that gender roles obviously are part of, again, a larger kind of idea of heteronormativity that we all grow up with, right? And I mean, heteronormativity is beyond the idea of only patriarchy, although it exists in fact to uphold the patriarchy, but it is intertwined with many ideas of what makes a worthwhile man or a worthwhile woman. And when we use the term worthwhile, it is helpful to ask worth whose while and worth what, right? Because it is that your worth to patriarchy or to the system is decided on the basis of how you look, what your caste is, what your class is, can you speak English? I mean, for example, in India, how much money do you make? and how do you behave in public. So, for example, sometimes when we have spoken to young men at Agents of Ishq, we have heard them talk about how when they're young, they are taught to think of certain kinds of women as high value women. And obviously, those are girls who are pretty in a certain kind of way, who are a little bit sexy but not aggressively sexual, who make the man feel a bit powerful and strong. And also, that if they can have one of those high value women, then they become high value men. So, the way in which we actually value each other as people becomes all about these external ideas of who the system has decided is a high value man and a high value woman. So, in essence, all of heteronormativity is about, burrowing into our self worth, taking away our sense of individual journeys, and telling us that we have to conform to some external structure. And our entire emotional, sexual, and social universe must be decided by these external ideas. So, I think within that, a man is one who pursues, and a woman is one who is pursued. And the more a woman is pursued, the higher her value becomes. And the more that a man who pursues is able to conquer and have conquests of women, the more his value goes up, right? And then this is a kind of continuously, it's a circle that keeps reproducing itself. I think the reason I stress the heteronormativity idea is that queerness, of course, changes all of these things. Or say, if you're a feminist who refuses to accept any of these ideas that, oh, if I'm thin, then I'm attractive. If I'm fat, nobody can want me. And we all know that's not really true on the ground. But if you have the courage to say that actually I don't agree with what everybody's saying in the world, then you queer the pitch in a sense. So queerness and feminism and transness and other ways of being than the heteronormative display to us that there are in fact other sexual universes. We already know that they're there. But the norm continuously that we all live with and grow up with is that romance is also about being pursued by a man for a woman. If a woman pursues a man, it's not all that romantic. So you had a lesser romance if you had to do the work, right? So there are all these hierarchies, and because of those hierarchies, we are creating a passive role for women and a kind of well, I won't say predatory, but definitely that kind of I have to not take no for an answer. A real man doesn't take no for an answer. That is also how a man's worth is judged in the social world, right? A woman is really liked if she is very acquiescent. Like if you're a very opinionated woman, as I am, for instance, and you speak your opinions freely, people are always a little bit uneasy about that. And like, for example, with a person like me, people are uneasy also because they don't know, like they like some things about me, and then they say like, oh, your writing is so compassionate, and then you got the flower in your hair, but oh my God, your opinions are so strong. So what do I do? Should I like her or should I not like her? So there is this kind of a conflict that if a woman is not acquiescent, then somehow she's not so appealing. And there is an idea that if a man is not an alpha man, a man who goes out and gets people to do his bidding, a man who is so virile that he can go out and command the entire world to do what he tells them to do, and that you can see in like male directors of films are supposed to be that way. The men that we venerate always, people who have startups, who basically men who treat a lot of people like shit in order to become really successful, are elevated onto a pedestal, and we are all taught to desire a man like that. So it also really complicates for women where they end up being in their sexual journeys, that they are schooled to desire a man like that. But the experience of the desire is often quite violent and not pleasant. And there is a confusion and a conflict about, well, I wasn't able to resist this thing because I was attracted to this person. I have been taught to be attracted to somebody. So actually, like, unpacking all of that requires a certain set of experiences. I also think it's unfair. Like, we expect people within the kind of awkward conversations about consent, we expect people to be like deconditioned in advance. But we have to create some space to decondition ourselves. I mean, that is why I always say that sex is the education. You can't actually do a full sex education beforehand. You can teach people a little bit about sexual health and some basic concepts, but eventually, as you proceed on your sexual journey, you start to learn what you like and what you don't like. And I think that is a really important thing. Learning to know what you like and don't like outside of what society has told you ought to like and not like. And once you can say, I like something, to follow that journey a little bit more, and it might lead you to a place very different, a very different destination than the one that society tells you should go to. Now, consent is like surrounded by this idea of gender. And that is why men don't hear women's. Do you think that the men who have continuously violated the consent of women did not know that it was wrong for them to do that? They know it. But the fact that they are not used to listening to women, like where in our culture are we given the habit of listening to women? How many women on the covers of magazines for being just awesome? But to be on the cover of a magazine, a woman has to be very good looking, or she has to have done something so outlandishly successful that we will then venerate her. But for men, their achievements are continuously celebrated, right? So we are used to listening to men. The majority of people, we listen to our men, not women. So if you're not used to listening to women, you'll just say, well, I mean, she said a feeble no, right? Like that's the famous judgment in the Faruqi case. She said a feeble no. She didn't really mean it. I didn't hear her demurral. I didn't sense her discomfort because I've not been trained to listen to the unspoken.
Absolutely. I want to talk about the unspoken actually in more detail, but I also want to just sort of focus for a little bit longer on this idea of women's acquiescence that you mentioned. Even legally, to some extent, women's agency is considered irrelevant, right? Marital rape is still legal. And when we think of how women are taught to see sex, it's as if our agency is irrelevant. It's some sort of duty, something you simply tolerate. Neither are you allowed to say no to it, nor are you allowed to be somebody very interested in it or assertive about what you want, right? You're supposed to let it happen to you, as opposed to be something you participate in. And so on the one hand, there's this negation of our saying no to sex as something valid, but there's also this shame around sort of asserting our desires, as if desire itself is a space of degradation for women, where we almost are meant to be ashamed if we are desirable, even, right? And so it's like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And even the legal framework that's supposedly here to uphold our rights as citizens or whatever, right, is in this case denying us any agency. I think it's very confusing then for women. Like, you don't even have legal recourse to some extent to support you in this idea of your own agency.
I think, the question of marital rape, I obviously do agree that it's emblematic of a certain perception about sex itself. I would just step away for a second from talking about gender to again talking about the way that heteronormativity and patriarchy function, within which sex is seen as something that's primarily to be had within marriage for the purpose of reproduction, right? That is its primary location. And therefore, whether women enjoy sex or not is really not important. And to be honest, I'm not very sure whether it's important that men enjoy sex or not either. Like, the pressure once you are married is, are you going to have a baby? Like, what's wrong? Why aren't you pregnant, right? So, yes, while the idea of men's pleasure is, of course, institutionalized and it's expected that men will seek their pleasures, but the whole idea of sex for pleasure is seen as a degraded idea. Like, a man who wants too much pleasure, it's maybe not tabooed in the way that women get ostracized for wanting pleasure, but men are also sometimes called ayash and seen as it's a little too much. It's like the pleasure loving person is generally considered decadent, and decadence is allowed to somebody who's privileged, but it is still seen as decadence. So in other words, sex itself is a kind of idea that creates a lot of unease, and sex as something that you desire and pursue and you steep yourself in pleasure is always seen as somehow a dodgy idea. It makes even a man a little bit less of a man if he's really into the pleasures of sex. That is why when you see how men talk about sex, it is always in terms of achievement. How much did you score? Did you manage to get her? So this kind of idea of battle and the hunt also pervades the way that men think about sex. If men began to think about genuine pleasure, right, not just like penetration and orgasm, but if they started thinking about pleasure, they would have to rethink their whole being. They would no longer be able to think only in terms of power. They would have to think in terms of mutuality, and that would definitely make them less of a man. But of course, when it comes to women, there is so much more control over women's bodies because women are seen as belonging to a community, belonging to a family, not as autonomous beings who and pleasure and desire are part of that autonomy, right? That is why it is so inextricably linked. The idea of pleasure and autonomy is linked to the idea of overall autonomy, because if I cannot have autonomy over my body and my desires, how am I going to exercise other autonomies? And there will always be something that holds me back, something that circumscribes me. So even if I am taught to be this person who achieves a lot and I will know no boundaries and I will just keep going, am I a full person? And am I really happy if all of my autonomy is not intertwined? So I think that within, for example, now the law on adultery has changed. But earlier, if there was adultery, the woman was always seen as an innocent, somebody who has been preyed upon by the adulterer. The adulterer is always outside and preying upon the property of the man who is married to this woman. So the idea that the woman might herself desire to have an affair is also absent, right? So the sheer absence of women's desire and the idea that women are the property of men, community, caste, and family, and that you have to, like, they have to, their womb has to be protected to ensure endogamy and inheritance, like these are all the ideas which underlie the notion that women don't have desire and women's desire must be controlled and constrained. So also when women don't enjoy sex, which is something they do bring up, right? Like if you look at what researchers have found, when women are unhappy in marriages and one of the things they say is that sex is horrible, they're told sex is horrible. Women are very rarely told that no, sex can be awesome, it can be fun, and you should be enjoying yourself. They told, yeah, it is awful. Like, men are that way only now. There's nothing you can do about men. Like, you just have to bear it. So it's sold to women as an idea that you are not supposed to feel that way. If you are going to talk about pleasure, you're shameless. And shame is a very important part of how we think about sex. But it is also told to men that if you don't want to have sex all the time, you're less of a man. Your job is to make sure that you get a woman. If a woman says no to you, your entire manhood has been thrown into question. And that is also why we have like acid attacks. We have so much kind of violence around rejection, or even violence to the self around rejection, because for men, the idea of rejection puts all of their masculinity into question.
There's so many things you've said that I want to like touch upon. But let's talk about power dynamics, because I happened to, in the research for this conversation, I happened to chance upon this article that Monica Lewinsky had written for Vanity Fair in 2018, 20 years after the initial investigation into her relationship with Bill Clinton. She's now in her 40s. This is in the aftermath of Me Too. And she wrote that while for decades she had seen her relationship with the former president as consensual, now she was beginning to consider that actually the power differentials between a White House intern and the president of the United States of America is so vast that perhaps the very idea of consent is rendered moot. And I think, you briefly sort of mentioned the complications in an endogamous society of caste, class, religion, all of that. And there are so many power dynamics at play often, right, in the way that we experience sex. So how do you think that factors in, and particularly in the Indian context?
I mean, already the idea that women are supposed to acquiesce to men is about a power dynamic of gender, right? That somehow a woman doesn't feel, and by consent, we don't only mean like having sex, but what type of sex you have, or to use contraception in sex, for example. Women find it very difficult to negotiate condom use because they don't feel able to talk about sex. They don't feel able to counter what is being said because that's not something that they have been taught to do, and that's not something ever discussed in public. So I think like gender obviously comes with that power dynamic written into it very clearly. And then other layers of our social identity, for example, yes, if there's a huge power differential between the person who is pursuing the sex and the person who is not sure they want to have that sex, right? Like, for example, you may be very flattered by the attentions of somebody who is powerful. That should not in itself be stigmatized, and being flattered by somebody's attention does not mean that you have to give in to their attentions, right? You may just simply feel flattered, and that's actually human and it's all right. But the idea that you even allowed yourself to feel pleased that somebody paid attention to you because they're a powerful person translates in your mind to meeting whatever is the requirement of the person in power, right? You're not responding to the idea of sexualness there, but to the idea of that person's power. It's not about you being attracted to them, but you having to give in to whatever they want. So I think, yes, like at the workplace, this is very clearly obvious to us that people who are in a position of power, or not only a position of power in the hierarchy of the organization, but who may be very successful in the world, who may be seen as very powerful. I mean, the president of the United States is as big as that gets. That the idea that that is an element in the interaction is important to consider. And that's why I think that, that one has to think about with some tenderness as an older person. Like if you're an older, successful man, there has to be some kindness in you to knowing that the younger person that you are making advances towards isn't fully able to resist your power. And how are you going to ensure that it's really consensual? I do think that onus is on you. It's very easy to say that person consented, but it's important to be aware of what are the many kinds of layers of power working on your side of things. So for that, you need a very different attitude towards sexual relationships and relationships in general, actually. So I think that caste is another obvious example that caste plays such a big role in Indian society and how we think about purity and how we think about dominance and acceptance, non-acceptance, whom we can treat in what way, and that, all of those things are so, there's a subterranean level at which they're operating. Sometimes people may end up saying yes because they don't feel able to say no. So that is why actually I feel that when we're talking about consent, we do talk about sex, but we must also talk about emotionality, relationality, love, or lovingness, I would say rather. Like, how are we going to create a society that is that kind-hearted? And, without taking away the fact that, yes, eroticism is about many different elements of our being, and that power is one of those elements. But all of these other things, and how do we look at each other as people, is actually central to the idea of consent. Without a real conversation about that, and without a real transformation in that, it's very difficult to have meaningful consent.
Absolutely. I have goosebumps when you talked about how, people in positions of power, older men need to simply be kind. And it makes me reflect back on several relationships I have had that I've thought of as consensual. And as I age, realize that, what they, I think that, it just complicates things, where I think, I too encounter the adulation of a very young person. At 33, if a teenager was like throwing themselves at me, I would politely dissuade them, tell them to do their homework, something, Whereas I feel like I've been on the other side of that as a very young person, where my admiration for a accomplished man, as you were saying, you're taught to admire powerful people or accomplished people, intellectually brilliant people, etc. And instead of that remaining platonic, I feel there's too often the invitation from the older, powerful man to sexualize the admiration. That were a man providing that admiration, they become their mentor or something, But when a woman is admiring of a man's work, he expects to be able to sleep with her. Anyway,
and I think that is also connected to the fact that men do not see women as full people. That is why they translate everything into a sexualization, and that we need, actually not just men, but the world needs to start seeing women as full people. There has to be more and more of that in society, right? So for us to engage with each other in that way. But I think that so many women also are taught that they get their value from the attention of men. That the approbation of a man means that you are intelligent. And so it is very confusing. It's very confusing if men are given the position in a society of being the ones who decide the worth of everybody else. It creates a real conflict of not even sometimes knowing what you are feeling towards somebody.
Exactly. Gosh, I feel like this shouldn't become about me though, but I have so many feelings. This is bringing up all the feels. But I shall professionally segue into my next question. We briefly talked about the fact that there are unspoken elements, non-verbal elements, if you will, to a sexual encounter. And there are. I think we're so often overemphasizing this yes, no, and communicating verbally, but we if we're honest, there's so much that is sort of intuited, or body language is sort of the means of communication, and it can often be misinterpreted, but it is a means of communication and we do use it, so we can't pretend it doesn't exist. And how would you advise young people who might not be so comfortable or even equipped with the vocabulary to always verbalize their desires? You know, how can I think you spoke of kindness, but perhaps along with kindness, there are other tools in the kit in terms of navigating the nonverbal, which I believe should be able to coexist with the verbal in our sexual interactions.
So I think that, if one wanted to do like a step by step thinking about consent, then what we're really saying is that at a very basic level, when we say yes means yes and no means no, this is a kind of principle idea, right? Like, but how is yes said and how is no said is multiple. And why is yes not always a yes and why is no not always a no? There are multiple reasons for this, and these reasons exist underneath the verbalization. And that when actually I find that like a lot of young people, their education on consent is not going beyond the yes means yes and no means no. And so they also like land up in social media comments to shout at everybody and say enthusiastic consent is the only consent. But I really wonder if they are in a position to make that enthusiastic consent, as we call it, in every interaction of theirs. So I first of all feel that we should expand the iterations of consent and also the iterations of non-consensuality, that we not consensuality, but when somebody is not consenting, how do we see that? And so I'll take an example of the Hindi film song, which I think like certain elite kind of young feministish type of commentariat tend to always homogenize and say, oh, all Hindi film songs about stalking, etc., etc. And I think there are at least 1 million Hindi film songs, maybe more. And as a person who's steeped in enjoyment of that entire musical culture, I can say there are definitely a few stalking, eve teasing, not a few, there are several stalking and eve teasing kind of songs, but there are dozens upon dozens of examples of consent also available to you in that flirtation, in what we call nok chok, in playing together, right? And the idea of playing together is actually based in pleasure. So I think first of all the culture needs to present these many iterations of how people interact with each other and arrive at consent. And they do it with romance, they do it with sexiness, because that's the other thing we hear, right? Like if everything is going to be so formatted, then romance is dead. But that's actually not true. And I recently actually watched a Korean drama which was full of consensual lines like, do I have your permission? And which was pretty steamy. So I was like, well, this is a good example of how there can be lots of romance and steaminess, but not in this very tinny way that you find put out in the, like enthusiastic consent doesn't have to be so tinny as the way that it is talked about in public. But there can be many versions of it that you see playing out. One of the things that we do on Agents of Ishq, which I think has been a response to this absoluteness which creates confusion, two things that we did actually. One is we created several, you could call them primers or manuals on, like one we made was called How to Make an Ishq Move Without Making a Dick Move, which we retitled to How to Make an Ishq Move Without Being a Creep. But in that we actually broke down that, say you meet somebody and you fancy them. Can you make a move? And then we put down all the kinds of possible relationships that you are in with them. Like, are you working with them? Are they a subordinate? Are they a student? Okay, you can't make a move on this person. But supposing there are none of these things and it is okay to make a move. Okay, you've made a move. Now, what is that person's response? And so actually, we wove into that the idea that sometimes discomfort is expressed non-verbally, and you should watch out for that. Sometimes interest is also expressed non-verbally, and you can look out for that. But the thing is, that too is a step-by-step thing. Like people may show a little bit of interest, but then not feel that much interest. But actually, nobody has ever broken it down for most people that way. So if you just break it down into these stages of interaction, which you can call the maybe stage if you like, then it actually helps people to understand that, okay, I can't go beyond this now. I thought this person was interested, but perhaps I was mistaken. Yes, this person was interested, but now they don't like me all that much as they thought they liked me. That hurts, but I have to let this go. So actually, we need to make this very routine, very ordinary. We have to take the sting away from rejection, in a sense, by talking about these things, so that people are not so panic stricken about hearing the no, which is what is also happening, I think, on the ground. The other thing that we have done is like created something we call sexual etiquette. So the idea that, because I also think that it all becomes very alarming and very sort of catastrophized, the way that we talk about what happens within sex. But if we were to speak about it not in terms of a cup of tea, which is that video that everybody likes to show, and as a person who hates tea, I'm like, this video doesn't even apply to me, so I don't know what to do with it. But I think that if we were to think about sex as just a routine part of our lives, and we were to intertwine it with other routine parts of our lives, like, for example, good manners, right? Like sometimes people would ask us questions on Agents of Ishq, which were not exactly questions about sexual, like sex education questions in that sense. And we would often think, like, how should we reply? Because there is no one reply to this person's question. But when the questions accumulated, what we really thought was these are all questions of how to behave with each other in sexual contexts. Like somebody will ask, if somebody goes down on me, am I expected to go down on them as well? So the idea is, of course, you're not expected to. But for example, if we reframe the answer in terms of good manners, and the idea that within good manners, we don't force people to do something they don't want to do, that's just good behavior with each other, I think it becomes like, it brings the temperature down on these things a lot. So it becomes very possible to think about it, very possible to do it. Or we received a question from a guy saying, if I see a girl on the bus and I think she's attractive and I stare at her, how does that violate her consent? So the idea that if you're staring at her and she's uncomfortable, you're making her uncomfortable, that violates the consent. You can take a peek. It's not bad to find the girl on the bus attractive. It is not fair to force your attractions upon her. There's a distinction. And I don't think this distinction is always made. When we are talking about consent, we have to be kind of aware to not stigmatize desire, to not, taboo the idea of feeling attracted itself, but to separate the two. And I think that doesn't always happen in the conversation on consent. So sexual etiquette has been really a useful way, I found, on Agents of Ishq to address a number of ways of thinking about the situations in which consent operates. Or, if I hook up with somebody and it's at my place, am I expected to ask them to stay the night? Now, these are not, like, you've already had sex with this person, but it's a question of intimacy. Like, how much intimacy do you want with this person that you've hooked up with? Are you comfortable having them stay or not? And I remember that we asked this question on Twitter and somebody answered it beautifully and said that a good host always offers, a good guest never imposes. And I thought, like, wow, this is really a nice way to think about it. So I don't think it's very useful to think in terms of, like, my personal space and, oh my, like, these hard-edged kind of frames, they make us adversaries to each other. So they take away the idea of mutuality. How many frames can we create that reiterate mutuality and pleasure and work out the idea of consent within those? I think that is productive. And similarly, we've done a bunch of stuff about flirting and how flirting without an agenda actually helps us to learn about consent. Yeah, because you're flirting to say, I think you're attractive. But that doesn't mean you have to do anything. And I can enjoy being flirted with and enjoy flirting back without it meaning it has to lead somewhere. So actually, it's like an entire education in, amorousness that we really want in order to have a consensual world, along with all the political change that brings equality otherwise.
I love that. I mean, I think flirting can be a way of being in an ideal world where there's no expectation and where simply desiring does not entail an expectation of action by either party. But you mentioned hookups, and it made me think of in a very sort of practical way, a lot of young people's courtship rituals, or when you're just meeting someone and figuring out whether things can go the sexual route, alcohol and other substances are often involved, right? It's almost like drinking particularly is like the social lubricant that allows for the courage to ask someone to take things to the next level physically or whatever. Personally, I don't drink actually because I think sex and alcohol are not a good mix, and I love sex. But I want to hear from you, and I'm sure many people deal with this conundrum of informed consent, how substance can complicate that, and how we can navigate that too in a safe way while still having fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people drink, it's like a thing that young people do, that to drink is cool and to be like totally blotto is a mark of your machismo, like drinking machismo. So this is the kind of bad practice of youth that many people go through. I do think that, yeah, like people end up having sex when they are drunk, and it's not always consensual. Sometimes it might be like, again, I don't know if it's a one size fits all rule, but I do think it's a good idea to maybe like not do it habitually, because there will be many situations which you might end up in which you don't like, where not only your consensuality but just your feeling of worth and enjoyment are kind of taken away from you, right? Because I think like when we are young, we do a lot of immoderate things, we are experimental, and I would really hesitate to tell young people that you shouldn't be experimental. And you are a bit of a nutcase when you're young, and you are a little wild and you do things that are ill advised. But somewhere I would not ever want to tell young people to not be adventurous. But when you're adventurous, there are going to be some missteps, there are going to be some dangers and risks. And the really important thing is, how are you going to build your resilience rather than let your adventures excoriate you to the point where you become embittered, where you feel disempowered, and where you simply are not able to navigate a life where you can say, well, I made some mistakes, or some things happened which were not great, and I don't really want them to happen again. So here are the things I'm going to do for myself, to keep myself feeling good and feeling safe in a way. So I think we are kind of missing that conversation on, like, actually we have a new project at Agents of Ishq about the idea of the safe space. And the central question we're asking in that project is, we always talk about a safe space as being safe from something. But what about if we asked about safe for what? Yeah. Like if I could say, I want to be safe to have fun, to do a few stupid things, and not then run into like horrible dangers, or, end up raped or that kind of a thing, then I think, yes, ideally you shouldn't drink and like mix sex and alcohol too much. But I mean, am I really going to say that, well, you shouldn't have got drunk, that's why this started happening to you? I think there's a very fine line between the two. At a more simple level, where we're not talking about this polarity of violence, I do think that, that's why I'm a big proponent of the idea of talking about sex not in terms of the penetration and the hookup as the score kind of idea, but the idea of sexualness. And I mean, that's why I also stress the words lovingness and sexualness, because they're not about having a type of relationship or a type of connection, but rather about the behavior towards each other and towards yourself. So I even think that, like the idea of cuddling and making out a little bit is something one should really talk about a lot, because you may want a little, like, you become a little sentimental and silly when you're drunk, and if you see that your friend has become that way and uh, you cuddle a little bit, that's not disastrous, right? Like it doesn't feel like you did something you wouldn't have done were you in your senses. And I think that's important. How does one create that context?
I love that. I wish that we could have fun without having to exercise so much caution. I feel like
Yeah,
even in my
yeah.
own life, it would be my fault if something bad happens. So I'm constantly having to choose to exercise caution even when I would like to have fun. And I wish we weren't put into that corner where you have to choose between your safety and fun. And as a result, I feel like women aren't expected to have fun. You shouldn't have fun.
Yeah,
Bad girls have
yeah,
fun.
yeah.
I often feel a lack of fun in my own choices and life, almost as if that's the default setting. Like I have to challenge
Yeah.
myself to have fun, you know.
Well, women are supposed to account for their existence all the time, right? Like we are expected to, we are supposed to justify that we have been allowed to be out in the world and to make some choices, and then we have to make good those choices. So for women to make a mistake, it's very fraught. Like women feel a sense of like, I have to I have to be top of my class. I have to do really well at work. I have to tell people that it was worth letting me have all these choices. But it shouldn't have to be. You should be free to not be an achiever as a woman. You should be free to just like drift if you want to drift. I mean, I call the kind of feminism that I love a poetic feminism for that reason. Like your life has to be an exploration you want to do, not an exploration somebody else tells you to do, right? So even as a feminist, I'm not going to tell somebody that look, you have to go out and achieve everything, but you have to achieve a truthful relationship with yourself and then hopefully be able to enact that relationship in the world, right? And that can mean being an achiever. It can be mean being a drifter who likes to read magazines and meet her friends and is pretty happy, decently paid job, and that's cool.
Absolutely. Okay, I want to go back to two very important themes that came up: shame and pleasure. Let's start with shame, though, because shame often interferes with pleasure. And I think that many people find that the shame that they're conditioned to feel around sex ends up interfering both with their ability to express what they want when they want something, as well as with their ability to deal with rejection. And so, would you like to share your thoughts on how shame functions, especially in well, the whole world is quite sex negative, to be honest, but how shame functions and how we can get better at stopping it from interfering with our pleasure in a way.
Yeah, I think for me the idea of pleasure comes first because I think pleasure is not just sex, right? Pleasure exists in so many domains. It exists, and I mean, it's in food, it's in reading, it's in what you watch, it's in what you like to wear, how you like to be, the things that you enjoy, basically, the things that make you feel good. And I think, like, if you proceed from a place of thinking that pleasure is an important part of life, pleasure is an important way of identifying for yourself who you are, what kind of person you are, what kind of life you would like to have, and what kind of days you would like to be able to live, then you might shape a very different trajectory for yourself. And the world itself could perhaps be shaped very differently. Right now, the world is not shaped for pleasure. Just because we have, a dozen OTT channels and so much entertainment, supposed entertainment on tap, that's a sort of kind of a false patina of pleasure. But pleasure as something that makes you feel connected to yourself and good is actually not encouraged. I mean, think about the way that even social media, which started out as being something which was meant to really encourage fun and faltugiri, like you're just wasting time and poking each other and playing vampire slayer, and there were so many meaningless activities we did online. But now the whole of social media has become this kind of puritanical productive space, and people are continuously checking how many likes, how many views. Like, even if you are not working as an influencer or somebody who uses social media for your work, you think of yourself as a being who must succeed on social media. And that success is measured with numbers and responses. Where in this landscape is the place for pleasure? Because pleasure is fundamentally not about productivity. Pleasure is about just for itself. It is not in order to serve some other purpose. It can't be made to serve another purpose. Hence, we talk about consent because not everything that is pleasurable is necessarily good, right? Not everything that I find pleasurable is not full of the potential for violence to you. And that is why consensuality is important, because when we recognize that every being has a different definition of pleasure, then we wait to understand whether our definitions of pleasure match before we move forward with something. And consensuality is really that concept, and hence the maybe kind of encapsulate this idea of getting to know one another and getting to know what are each other's boundaries, what are the places where you can have a commonality or mutuality. But I think pleasure also is full of hierarchies, of caste, of gender as well, and of race, nationality. So, for example, romance novels, considered to be inferior, things that girls enjoy, are often mocked as being unimportant. But I think that for me, romance novels open up a world of fantasy. And because I fantasized so much, I fantasized myself right out of reality and refused to accept that what the world told me is supposed to be my journey in life is a journey that I want. I didn't want it. And I think that if I had not read so many like hot and heavy romance novels as a young person, I might have been encouraged to stick to a certain kind of very conventional, respectable path. So, actually, the idea of what gives us pleasure being dismissed as unimportant, as being superfluous, is a way that we are taught to have shame. For example, if I say, I simply love hot chocolate fudge, I'm a fat woman who is not supposed to say that with so much pleasure, because the thought that the person in front of me is going to have is, well, I mean, that's why you're putting on so much weight. So I'm supposed to feel ashamed both about how I look and about the things that I find delicious to eat, right? So, and there will be days when with somebody I can say it freely, and on a day, even a person like me will feel that slight thing in the gaze of someone who looks at me askance when I say this kind of thing. So, actually, the things that I might find pleasurable, like say eating meat because of my caste, will be looked down on by somebody as like, oh my god, people who eat meat are inferior. So we are taught to have shame about the food that we eat. When you go abroad, right, one of the things that Americans would often say when I was working there was like, oh, Indian food smells. And so you would feel ashamed of the smell of the food, which actually gives you immense pleasure. Like I remember coming home from school and smelling all the pulkas being made in all the flats as all the kids were coming home from school, or the way that we feel when onions hit the oil and we can smell that, like lovely smell of onions cooking. Like these are the things that give us joy, but we learn to be ashamed of those things. As we are learning to have shame about those things, we are learning to be ashamed of who we are essentially, and to accept power and hierarchy. So shame is a very powerful tool to keep us all in place and to continuously override our consent. Shame is a way that we're educated not to have consent, actually, and to give others power over us. And it operates so insidiously because you might overtly say everybody is equal, but then in these very insidious ways, you would poke away at our equality by making us feel lesser because we don't read the same things, enjoy the same movies, love the same songs, appreciate the same kind of colors or whatever it is, and also the kind of sex we might like to have or how we might like to express ourselves sexually, of course, is intertwined with that. And the larger idea of taboo operates even more deeply within sex. So actually, we are all the time ashamed of many aspects of ourselves. And the taboo on sex, which taboo is a thing which you just intrinsically feel, like though all of that is a toxic mix, which makes it very difficult to know who you are. If you don't know who you are, the question of rights is not sufficient to exercise your personhood. Rights are a basic, but to exercise your personhood, to be recognized as a person, means your pleasure has to be recognized. And the idea that pleasure is diverse has to be recognized and accepted and even woven into the fabric of society. The idea that children will do some things for enjoyment, not all the time do some things to come first in class and become like perfect little capitalist citizens. There has to be a place for that, right, in our world. Yeah.
Yeah, shame sort of makes us the gatekeepers of our own access
Yeah.
to pleasure, we
Yeah.
deny,
Yeah.
and despite knowing it, one still does. I feel so trapped in many of the
Yeah.
capitalism,
Absolutely.
productivity, good girl syndrome, all of it. But we've talked about so much that many people to whom this might be slightly new information or might not have had the chance to think deeply about it might find it a lot to process. And so I wanted to also leave our listeners or viewers with some very sort of practical tips, if possible, around navigating consent. Or we can start with your top tip for asking for consent, perhaps, and then we can move on to withdrawing consent and dealing with rejection, if that's okay.
Yeah. I think there are some simple things. One, the first and most important thing is to know yourself well. I think very often we are so concerned with being selected or being selectors, whatever, that we aren't even thinking whether we really want the thing that we are chasing, right? So I think there are many young women we speak to who have a more restricted lives, right? Like they live in traditional environments where they're not given that much freedom. So for the person who doesn't have that much freedom, the chance to have sex or the chance to have romance is so tough that they often accept many non-consensual and violent contexts because it's the only way to experience a little bit of that romance. So I think that they are not even thinking, do I really want this person or not? They're just thinking about how to get that little window of exploration. So I think that, but for those of us who are like not leading such constricted lives, I think it's pretty important to think, do I really want this person? Do I really want this thing? How much do I want to know yourself well? And to know that what you're looking for is something you desire, first of all. And I think that will automatically reduce your panic about consent. Whether, should I say yes? Should I listen to the no? All of those things. I think reading non-verbal cues is something that you should educate yourself in. And if you are uncertain, you should step back. So, for example, if somebody is being polite, somebody is not outright telling you no, but you can sense that they're not warmly responding to what you're saying. If you can understand when somebody is not welcoming you to do more, they're not stopping you, but they're not actually inviting you to do more, and it's confusing you, step back. So I think feeling that this is my only chance is something you should stop feeling, because we often think this is my only chance to get love, sex, desire. We don't respect consent. We don't even respect consent within our own selves. Like, we allow non-consensuality to happen to us, and definitely we override other people's consent. But remember that there will be other chances when you can explore desire. And in fact, the more relaxed you become vis-a-vis desire, the more likely that you will see those other chances and be able to avail of those other chances. So, actually having an idea of plenty, not having an idea of scarcity about yourself, about the world, and about desire will open up the landscape for you, such that you don't make every interaction, every swipe, and every hookup into an emergency judgment on your worth and what you have gained or lost. I think if you are rejected, it's tough. And you should not pretend it's not tough. The way that you should not pretend is by crying if you want to cry, talking to your friends. You can like behave in an undignified way by yourself or with your friends, but you can't do it to the person who's rejected you, right? I think like it's important for us to acknowledge it's painful to be rejected. It's embarrassing at best and hurtful at worst. But it's not a judgment on who you are. You are not forever and ever the person who was rejected today. You are still you tomorrow. And even if you are rejected tomorrow, day after tomorrow, you may not be. And it's, I guess, okay to be rejected. So I think that will automatically make it so much easier to navigate consent, to not see rejection as failure of some kind. And I think to think a lot more about what kind of relationships you'd like to have. Don't think about relationships in terms of destinations, in terms of yes and no, score or no score, having and not having, but actually spend some time imagining what is the kind of amorous life you want. Like, do you want lots of fun, romance? How can you have that life rather than just like, how can I have it or not have it? I think like making our idea of ourselves and of sexual relationships much more expansive will really, I know it sounds very general, but actually it's the key to being able to then pursue the things you really want. A lot of the time we are pursuing things the world tells us we ought to pursue, and we become very anxious, and so we override consent. But think of the kind of person you want to be. Like, if you don't want to be an asshole, it is not so difficult to think about how to be consensual. So actually just ask yourself, do I want to be a jerk? Or do I want to be like somebody who's got the confidence to accept rejection and to look for other things in the world? So I think that goes a long way in helping us.
Thank you so much, Paro. It's been such a pleasure chatting, and thank you for being so generous with your time and your magic. And I really hope that anyone watching or listening to this today is inspired to approach consent with more love and more tenderness and more kindness and more pleasure. So thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone who's tuned in today as well. Thanks so much for joining us. Love Matters is produced by Indian Express and DW, Germany's international broadcaster, and we'd love to hear from you. So if you have a story or an insight that you might like to share, you can email us at lovematters@dw.com. And please do rate this podcast. Please do share it with your friends. Leave us a review. Till next time, I'm Leeza Mangaldas, and I think that love matters.